So once again, this is a double topic lecture. So as you saw in your course outline, today's lecture is both Chapter 8, Identity, and Chapter 9, Autonomy. And in a lot of ways, identity and autonomy pretty much go hand in hand, right? In adolescence, we're trying to figure out who we are, and we're also then striving for that independence away from our parents, our family, figuring it, and that goes with figuring out who we are, right? How do we get by as adults? So that's why I've put these two chapters together. And in fact, the media item, which of course we'll get to at the end, but as you already know from your course outline, is a movie called Blinded by the Light, which is a great representation of an adolescent trying to figure out both his identity and gain that autonomy. So that's where we're going to go. So why do we think about identity as an adolescent issue? Well, first of all, we got to once again go back to our good friend puberty, and didn't start the actual, there we go, the actual timer. So we got to go back to puberty and the role it has, and of course, through puberty, we're changing on the inside, we're also changing on the outside, right? So our bodies are changing on the inside and on the outside, how other people see us, what our bodies are now capable of. And that fuels changes in self-concept and self-esteem. Okay, so we need to think about that. And then we also go back to the cognitive changes. So basically, we're going to go back to our three foundations, our biological changes, our cognitive changes, our social changes. From cognitive change and identity development, there's two notable changes. One is our ability to think about possible selves. And we're talking about possible selves. We're not talking about making new versions of ourselves and having a whole little army of minions that are just like us. But we're talking here about being able to imagine having different identities for ourselves. So thinking about, what's it going to be like? What am I going to be like as a university student? And maybe thinking about yourself in your chosen career. Maybe thinking about yourself in a relationship, a romantic relationship. Or maybe thinking of yourself as a parent, right? We're able to think about these different possible selves, and that's something that children aren't terribly good at, right? So children will talk about, when they grow up, they're going to be, and it's one thing, and it's just the one thing. So as adolescents, we're getting better able to think about different versions of ourselves that we might be. That's the possible selves. And then this future orientation is the extent to which the person can think about the potential consequences of decisions and choices. So again, our cognitive skills evolve to where we can actually think about, well, if I choose this, this is what's going to happen. So if I choose to drive really fast, what can happen? Nothing, right? There could be no police officers, no photo radar, nobody else on the road, nothing happens. If you choose to drive really fast, you could get a speeding ticket, either getting pulled over physically by a police officer or getting a photo radar ticket, which will probably come addressed to your parents because your car is probably registered to them, which means you've got a whole lot of explaining to do. Or you could end up having an accident. And we know that car accidents, even at a low or slow rate of speed, can be devastating. So imagine one at a high rate of speed, right? So now we think about those things before we speed, and maybe we come to a number or a speed that we're comfortable at. It might be above the legally posted speed limit, but we're still comfortable at that, but we know that if we go faster than that, we're not comfortable with it simply because we're not willing to accept the consequences of what might happen. I remember when I lived in upstate New York and I would go to Montreal, there was a segment of the 401 through Ontario that I had to drive on. And Ontario, to try to deter speeding, had big signs up that said, so the speed limit was 100. If you are caught going 120, this is how much the ticket will be and how many demerits. If you were caught doing 130, this is how much it'll be and how much the demerits are, and 140, what the price was and the demerits. And I looked at it and I'm like, well, 120 isn't bad, right? Like if I get beamed at 120, I'm okay with that. I don't want to get beamed at 130. That's too expensive, but I'm willing to pay. And I was very fortunate. I never did. I typically set my cruise control at about 118. and then never got a ticket. Again, you figure out the things you got to do, but I was able to think about, that future orientation. What could I live with in the future? What would the consequences of my actions be? Children really don't think about it, right? Children live in the moment. So in adolescence, that's a big change that we're able to start thinking about these things. And then in terms of social roles and identity development, self-conception, self-esteem, and sense of identity are all interrelated. It's really hard in adolescence to think about one without thinking about the others. And of course, when we're talking about self-conceptions, we're talking about how the individual describes themselves. When we're talking about self-esteem, it's the degree to which an individual feels positive or negative about themselves. And then the sense of identity is the extent to which the person feels secure about who they are and who they are becoming. And so we can see that they're all related. How we describe ourselves, how positively or negatively we see ourselves, and how secure we are in who we're becoming. That's all going to be connected, and that all ends up sort of bouncing off the other people in our social world, right? So if you really, really, really had your heart set on a particular career, and your family and your friends were like, no, 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 and they gave you good reasons why, no, 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 but you had already based part of your identity on becoming that, what do? Who are you then, right? Or what if you had this plan and everybody encouraged you and supported you, but then you didn't get into the program you wanted? Or you got in and you failed out? Then what, right? So all of these things are related, because if you've banked on your identity being one thing and then things don't work out, well, now what's your self-conception? How do you describe yourself? And what's your self-esteem like, right? How positive are you about yourself, or how negative are you after you've just bottomed out? So all of that is connected. Some of these changes in self-conceptions that we see in adolescence. Adolescent self-conceptions become both more differentiated and more organized. And what that really means is that differentiation is that realization that we can be different in different situations. We're not always the same person, okay? So when I come to class, and certainly on these days when I'm recording these video lectures, I'm enthusiastic, I'm positive, right? I'm energetic. It's like, let's go. On other days, I may not be quite so, right? And so I think about, an adolescent who's like, I'm really shy until I get to know people. And then I'm really friendly. Or I'm generally a really happy person, but when I have to deal with my brother, I'm grumpy, right? So they're able to differentiate, whereas children don't tend to do that. Children tend to think they're one thing or their mood is one thing. They can't hold on to they can be one way with one person and a different way with a different person or in a different situation. In terms of more organized, what I'm talking about here is putting the descriptors or the traits together in a logical way. So again, if we go to the example I used before, that here on these days that I'm filming these video lectures, I'm enthusiastic, I'm energetic, right? It would be weird if I was like, well, I'm enthusiastic, but I'm also just like really tired and like, like my back hurts a little, I'm not used to standing all day, but I'm really energetic. That's completely disorganized, right? So I'm giving you the things that are organized together, enthusiastic, energetic, and, well, sleep deprived. I'm a parent. That's just par for the course, right? But I would put that in a separate category. I wouldn't present it all at once. And so adolescents get better at doing that too. They put together the traits or the pieces of themselves that sort of go together, and then they sort of chunk that apart from some other pieces. What also happens is adolescents start to recognize when they are engaging in false self-behavior. And so this is basically when they're behaving in ways that are inauthentic. So, some of you probably have an older relative who you don't really like, right? Whether it's an aunt, an uncle, a great aunt, a great uncle, or some friend of the family that you always have to be nice to. You've always been told you just have to be nice to them, you have to be polite. And so you are, but as an adolescent, you are rolling your eyes at like 1,000,000 miles a minute when nobody's looking. And you know that you are being fake when you're being kind to them because really you don't like them. As a child, you would just be being kind because your parents told you you had to be kind or you would get in trouble, right? Or they'd be upset with you. But as an adolescent, you sort of realize like, yeah, I'm just kind of playing a game, going along with it, but really I don't want to spend any time with this person, but I have to, so I'll just roll my eyes at them when they're not in the room and recognize that you're not being your true self. Now, we also talk about these dimensions of personality. This is basically going to be a complete review. You've heard about this in multiple psychology classes at this point, I should say. The 5-factor model, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. The 5-factor model was developed on work with adults, but we see that it applies to adolescents as well. And it's just a way to think about personality. Certainly we can think about some examples like a really good student, right? Like a really good student is probably high on conscientiousness and maybe also on neuroticism a little bit, right? Like they're double checking every assignment. They're always double checking with the prof. Is this how you want it? If I have it done before the due date, can I turn it in early? Will you look at a draft, right? So they're just that little bit extra. We might also think about an adolescent who's a big risk taker, right? Someone who's really always just searching for that next thrill. Well, they're probably higher on extroversion, and they're probably very high on openness to experience. They're willing to try anything, okay? Including things like, I think it was cricket pizza at Stampede a couple of years ago. All sorts of weirdness. Yeah, no interest, thank you very much, but you want to go ahead and eat crickets, you go right ahead. Chocolate-covered grasshoppers, anyone? Anyway, okay, so let's talk about some of the changes in self-esteem that we see. So what we need to consider here are 3 things again: self-esteem, self-consciousness, self-image, stability. And we're talking about stability here. We're really talking about the extent to which a person's ranking within a group on a particular trait stays more or less the same over time. So we're not saying that they stay exactly the same, but relative to other people, they stay the same. So a child who is shorter than most of their peers will likely remain shorter into adolescence and into adulthood. But they aren't going to still be as short as they were as an 8-year-old when they're 28. So they will have grown taller over time, but they will still be considered short compared to their peers. That's what we mean by stability, right? So it's not that it doesn't change, it's just that it changes in line with how other people are also changing in that regard. I hope that makes sense. Makes sense to me, so I'm going to go with that. So what happens to self-esteem, self-consciousness, and self-image stability, right? Do they stay stable? Do they change? So self-esteem becomes more stable through adolescence. So in earlier adolescence, we're going to see more variability in self-esteem. And then as we progress through, it starts to level out and stay more stable. So someone who has very low self-esteem as a 16-year-old likely still has very low self-esteem as a 19-year-old and as a 24-year-old. Someone who has like an average level of self-esteem is probably going to stay there as well. Someone who has a high level of self-esteem will probably stay there as well. We see that stability. Self-consciousness has to do with how much a person worries about their self-image. And so this is a bit of a question for you. When do you think that's more of an issue in adolescence? Right? So again, we talked about earlier with the cognitive changes, the personal fable and the imaginary audience. So those, of course, tie into this idea of self-consciousness. And usually, as our identity firms up, we become somewhat less self-conscious because we feel more assured of who we are. And it doesn't matter to us as much if other people view us in a certain way, right? And then finally, self-image stability is the degree to which our self-image changes from day to day. And again, there's going to be some variability in there, particularly when certain things happen. You know, I was and I'm going to use the word victim here because I really did feel like a victim of a really bad haircut in grad school. Like, so bad that I called my 2 closest friends afterwards and I was like, I need to wear a hat until my hair grows out. And they were like, it can't be that bad. And then I met up with them and they're like, oh shit, it is. They're like, I don't know if there's enough bobby pins and barrettes to save that. You might have to get some baseball hats, right? Like you might need, and I'm like, what happened? So yeah, I had a dip there. And then I swore I would never go anywhere else except to the one guy who was cutting my hair at that point. Because, oh my God, that was brutal, right? And that takes a hit, but then leveled back out once my hair was back to the way I liked it and the way it worked. Okay. Moving on. So again, something you've heard about in other psychology courses, certainly in lifespan development, probably in intro as well, probably in some other classes, is Erik Erikson and his psychosocial stages of development. And what Erikson said is that at different points as we get older, we come to this crisis, and if we successfully overcome the crisis, then we sort of move on to the next stage and all is well. And so at adolescence, the crisis is identity, okay? Excuse me. So the adolescent crisis is to establish a coherent sense of identity. Developing an identity is a social and mental process. So things that happen in our social experience, the people we interact with, the feedback they give us, and not just like feedback, they sit us down and go, you know, that shirt you wore today, I didn't particularly care for it. I don't think it, you know, highlighted the color of your eyes. But the feedback that we get when we're saying something and people react or don't react, or when someone does compliment you and then on a day when they don't, you're like, oh, did I do something weird, right? So we get that feedback from our social relationships, certainly. And then also we have to think about the mental process pieces. What do we do with all these bits of information? And also, where is it that we're trying to go? Where are we trying to get to? So both of those components feed in, and the end goal, of course, is to develop a coherent sense of identity. So according to Erikson's framework, the crisis at adolescence is identity versus identity diffusion. If we settle it well, we end up with our solid sense of identity, and we move along. Now, one of the things that Erikson talked about as well is this idea of me drinking some water. He did. He didn't know me, didn't know I'd be doing this, but talked about me drinking water. Okay. One of the things Erikson did talk about in this period is what's known as the psychosocial moratorium, which is kind of like a timeout. It's a timeout from the other responsibilities you have to spend some time exploring what you're interested in and figuring out who you are. So when we think about people staying in school longer now, when we think about more people going to college, so when we talked about schools, we talked about how now more high school graduates go on to college and university rather than directly into the workforce, that's a bit of a chance for this psychosocial moratorium to try different things. It's one of the reasons here at Mount Royal we have things like the Gen Ed program, right? We don't want you to just come in and study one thing and one thing only. We want you to be exposed to a breadth of different ideas that might inform some of how you think later on, what you choose to do later on, how prepared you are to be a good citizen, not just a good scholar, but a good citizen when you leave MRU. Okay. So having that time and space hopefully allows you to figure it out. Now, there can, of course, be problems in identity development as well. And one of the things is this idea of identity diffusion. And that's when a person basically emerges from adolescence with an incoherent, disjointed, incomplete sense of self. So they don't really know where they're going, what they're doing. They're just kind of floundering. And I don't want anybody to feel like they're personally being picked on here. But if you're in your 10th year of your undergraduate degree, having been attending studies on a full-time basis, you just may be in identity diffusion. If you have been undeclared for the last 8 years, you just might be in identity diffusion. If you have changed majors more times than the number of semesters of university you have attended, you, my friend, might be in identity diffusion, right? So those are the sorts of things, like, by the time you're getting close to graduating from university, and again, this is a third-year psychology class, so I am assuming that most of you are third, fourth, fifth, sixth year, whatever, no judgment there. You have a sense of what you want to do next. If you're third, fourth, fifth year and still don't know, like have no idea, you're like, well, I could do this or I could do that, you might be there. Some of you may have taken, I remember in high school, they gave us this it was kind of like a job aptitude test that we had to do, and it suggested careers for you as a result. And I don't remember all of my results, but I do remember 3 of them, I think. One was physiotherapist, one was florist, and I think the other one was like photographer or something. And I'm like, well, those all seem loosely unrelated, right? So this was supposed to help me hone in on what I wanted to do. And I'm like, yeah, no, none of those. And none of those even make sense, right? Because it would make sense if, let's say, I had been sort of tracked in the medical fields, if it was like doctor, dentist, nurse, optometrist, right? Like any of those things, like, yeah, I could see. But this, like, florist, physiotherapist, very different jobs, very different job descriptions and job activities. So if you are currently debating whether you should be a florist or a physiotherapist, you, my friend, might still be in a state of identity diffusion. Some people, on the other hand, end up in a state of identity foreclosure. And when we're talking about identity foreclosure, we're talking about people who have made a decision about what they're going to be without having explored options. Sometimes this is them doing it, sometimes this is being done for them. So, for example, if your family has a family business and your whole life you have been being groomed to take over said family business, what do you think the chances are you can look at your parents and say, you know, I don't want to do that? Probably not. So you're probably going to do it even if it's not what you want to do, because that's what's expected of you, right? Look at Prince Harry. Spent his whole life being groomed to never be king, essentially, right? Because he was third in line for the crown until Prince William started having kids, and then each kid bumped him further down because Prince William's kids take precedence over Harry in that weird way that the monarchy works. And so Harry, for a lot of years, went along with it. Was like, yep, I'm a good prince. I'm going to do all the good princely things. I'll go do my military service. I'll go call myself this. I'll go do all these do-good projects. And then one day he said, enough. This is not the life I chose for myself. Now that my brother has had 3 children and there is 0 chance of me ever becoming king, I'm going to go off and do what makes me happy. And that means moving away from England. That means becoming financially independent. It means getting married and having children of my own. And yes, still being good looking, right? So Prince Harry, for years, was sort of in this identity foreclosure, and then he moved himself out by developing his identity. Again, hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. And then we have negative identity, which is when somebody takes on an identity that is counter to what their parents or community would expect of them, right? So a son of a police officer becoming a robber, because that's a great career, by the way. Very successful typically, right? Or if my daughter were to decide, I'm going to drop out of high school over my dead body child, just putting that out there, right? So clearly I believe in education. I think higher education is very important. I'm a staunch believer in what a liberal arts degree can do for people. And so if my child were to look at me at some point in high school and be like, school's not important, it's not for me, I'm dropping out, I'd be like, what did I do wrong? How did I fail you? Why are you seeking out a negative identity? And the answer is usually a negative identity is developed because the person hasn't been getting recognition for the positive things that they've been doing, right? So again, if I use myself as an example, if my daughter was doing pretty well in school, but every time she came home and I said, well, you know, like that's not perfect. That's not really good enough. Like I know you're happy that you got a 92, but like a 92 is not 100. That means you made mistakes. And if I do this repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, she's like, it doesn't matter how well I do. If I'm not perfect in school, it's not good enough. So fuck it, I'm not doing school anymore, right? So not to say that we want to heap on praise for every little thing, but we have to be careful with what our expectations are of people, particularly of our children, or if you're going to work with adolescents, with children in schools. Be careful of what your expectations are and what you reinforce and what you don't, because if you aren't giving attention and positive attention for the good things they're doing, they may well decide, screw it, and move towards this negative identity standpoint. Okay. Talk just a little bit about identity and ethnicity. There's certainly more to say than what I'm going to say, but again, as I drop my notes, I did have to edit some of what I wanted to talk about just so that we can get through this material, because we are doing 2 chapters. So I just wanted to be clear that there is certainly more to talk about here. But when we're talking about ethnic identity, we're talking about the aspect of the individual's sense of identity concerning their ancestry or racial group membership. So one of the problems, of course, that faces people in developing their ethnic identity are the ideas that other people have about their ethnic group or racial group or their ancestry. And in living in mainstream society, or even adjacent to mainstream society, that factors in. And so people sometimes try to shy away from their ethnic identity in an attempt to blend in more. We hear more and more about people who are what are known as white passing, where they look white to other people even though they might not be, and they go ahead and accept it because it's easier to pretend to be part of the majority group than to constantly be educating people and battling some of the discrimination and disadvantages that are afforded to people from diverse groups. So there's a lot that goes into this, and I feel like we're only going to be able to spend a few minutes on it, which is not really fair. So I really want to encourage you to make sure that you read the whole part of the textbook, and of course bring any questions that you have to our in-person discussion. Okay, so where am I here? I'm here. So part of developing an ethnic identity is ethnic socialization or racial socialization, which is the process through which an individual develops an understanding of their ethnic or racial background. Okay, so how they understand who they are, where they're from in the sense of their background. And there's 3 themes that come up here. One is understanding and valuing one's own culture. Right? You can identify with a culture and know very little about it, and it's not going to feel all that authentic to you. So the more you know about it, the more you feel a part of it. The second theme is dealing with racism, because unfortunately, if you're different, if your skin isn't white, if you're, again, I go back to Nazi Germany sometimes and think, well, if you're not white with blue eyes and blonde hair, you're nothing, right? So thinking about what discrimination, what racism has been directed towards your group, and sort of how do you deal with that? And then finally, how do you then succeed in mainstream society? When mainstream society will always look at you as different somehow, which is really, really a problem. And that's been magnified lately, of course, with the events that have happened in the United States surrounding the 2020 presidential election. Things got real ugly real fast. I still don't understand why. I mean, I understand why on one level, but it's like the color of a person's skin, their country of origin, doesn't determine their worth as a person. What religion they belong to, what God they pray to, if they pray to a God at all, doesn't determine their worth as a person. Their actions do, right? So we really do need to work not on saying, you know, and again, this is, know that I do not believe this in the way it's been used, but like the All Lives Matter movement, some people try to justify it saying, well, but all lives do matter. And it's like, well, yes, all lives do matter, but my life isn't threatened if I'm pulled over by the police, right? The police aren't going to pull a gun on me when they're walking over to my car. But if I were black, they might. And if I were indigenous, they might look at me and search me for drugs. But I'm not. So that doesn't happen to me. And I'm aware of that. So yes, sure, on the level of every human being matters, yeah, but every human being doesn't face the same issues. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, the Trans Lives Matter movement, the Black and Indigenous people of color lives matter movement, all of this is important because it's not about erasing people's ethnic identity. It's about having a realization that everybody should be able to be proud of their identity and identify the way they choose and still have a seat at the table, right? Everybody gets a seat at the table. And if we run out of space at the table, then we get another table. We don't cut people off, we create more room. And I think that's a really important thing to hang on to. We don't want people to say, well, I need to assimilate into mainstream culture in order to be successful. No, you shouldn't have to do that. And oftentimes it seems like you do, but you shouldn't have to. Okay, soapbox moment over, I think. I just get really aggravated, clearly, as you have now seen. Okay, one of the things that's interesting having to do with ethnic identity has to do with recent immigrants and what's known as the immigrant paradox. So what's really interesting is that if we look at adolescent psychosocial development and adjustment, and we look at recent immigrants from a given place. So for this example, I'm just going to use people from Mexico. Okay, so people who are Latinx, people who have recently immigrated to Canada from Mexico. Those adolescents are likely to show better psychosocial adjustment than someone who was born in Canada whose family immigrated from Mexico 2 or 3 generations ago. And part of the reason for that, of course, is the systemic racism and discrimination built into our system. The fact that the people who have been here for generations, they've already now grown up embedded in that, and that's been what's been passed down generation to generation. The new immigrant hasn't been, if you will, tainted by all of the discrimination that is present in our society yet. So they actually have an easier time of it than someone who's been here longer. And it doesn't make, on the one hand, it doesn't make sense, but on the other hand, it really does. And that's what is known as the immigrant paradox. Okay, in terms of discrimination and its effects, certainly we know that discrimination causes harm, period, end of sentence. What I would encourage you to do is think back to Star in The Hate U Give, which of course was the movie you watched for social transitions, and thinking about what Star went through sort of living in these 2 different worlds, right? So living in the projects with her family, and even for a family in the projects, her family was portrayed as a successful family. Her mother was a medical professional, her father owned a business. But then her life at school, where, you know, other than her siblings, they were like the only Black people at school, just about. So fitting into this very white world and what that was like and the discrimination she faced, and a lot of it were those microaggressions. It's nobody outright saying you are lesser than because you're Black, but the way she was treated, the way she and her friends were treated, the idea that reaching for a comb is enough to, or a hairbrush is enough to get someone killed, right? Because they're Black. Discrimination has huge effects on identity development. And then finally, we'll talk for just a moment about multi-ethnic adolescence. And what I just want to say is there are particular challenges for biracial adolescents. One of them is often that their classmates don't perceive their ethnic identity the same way as they do. So for adolescents who are biracial, and whether this is having one parent who is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, and one parent who is white, whether it's having two parents who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, but of different types, people don't necessarily always see you as how you are. And that was where earlier in this video I talked about this idea of white passing, that some people who in fact would identify as a person of color, their skin is light enough because they are biracial, that they are identified by others as white, even though they in fact would identify as belonging to an ethnic group. So we have to be really careful about this. We need to not make assumptions. One of the things that as a clinician and from the standpoint of clinical psychology that I always think about is it's not my job to define who a person is, it's their job to tell me who they are. Because I might look at someone and just automatically have assumptions, and assumptions just make an ass out of you and me. Well, when you assume, not assumption, because that's just more complicated letters there. But essentially, people get to tell their own stories, and they get to write their own stories. And so we really need to be cognizant of that when people, particularly adolescents, are biracial. I mean, for everybody, but for them in particular, there could be that tremendous stress over people making assumptions about them that are in fact quite false. And then lastly, for identity, talking about identity and gender. So again, just some basic terminology. Gender identity is how we see our own gender. And again, we're focusing here on male, female, and trans, okay? Sexual orientation is whether you are sexually attracted to people of the same gender, the opposite gender, or both, okay? Or sorry, same sex, opposite sex, or both. Gender role behaviors are the extent to which we behave in traditionally male and female ways. So, traditionally, we tend to think of women as being more involved in childcare than men. That would be a gender role behavior, right? When you think about someone barbecuing, you probably think more about a guy barbecuing than a woman. That would be more of a male gender role behavior. And then, of course, people who identify as transgender is when their gender identity differs from the sex they're assigned at birth. So these are all just things. There's no right or wrong here, right? So if you are assigned male at birth, but you see yourself as female and you feel like you're female, so be it, right? If you are sexually attracted to people of the same sex, so be it. If you're sexually attracted to people of the opposite sex or both, so be it. What happens in other people's bedrooms and what happens in other people's undergarments, so to speak, like what's there, really doesn't matter. How does it affect you who someone else sleeps with or what bathroom someone else pees in? Right? So I get really frustrated when it's like, well, I need to know if someone's transgender. I need to know if there's a man, someone who biologically was male, is using the female restroom. Why? Why does that matter? Why should it matter? Right? But these are things that adolescents are coming to terms with. We saw in, oh no, we didn't see it yet. Oh, just kidding, I almost just blew it. One of the movies you're going to watch later on, oh, wow, Carrie. So one of the movies you're going to watch later on in the term has to do with an adolescent realizing that, or not just realizing as an adolescent that he's homosexual, but finally voicing it and what that's like, right? And I was actually thinking about this the other day, a little bit like, you know, people who are homosexual, we put the pressure on them to come out when they're ready, of course, and declare themselves as homosexual. Well, I didn't have a heterosexual coming out party, and now I kind of wish I had, right? Like, why can't I gather up all my friends and, stand on a podium and go like, hey, I'm straight? We just assume, right, this heteronormative world that we live in, we assume that you're straight until proven otherwise. But why do we do that? Why don't we just assume everybody's homosexual and then just make people declare their heterosexuality? Like, what if we flip the script on that? Just a thought, right? Why do we call it a gay wedding? It's a wedding. My wedding wasn't called a straight wedding. People were like, oh, we're going to carry straight wedding this weekend. So why is a gay wedding classified as a gay wedding? Why do adolescents need to be thinking about all this? Why can't they just live their lives and love who they love and be who they are? And if someone who has a penis wants to wear a skirt, so be it. Like, what? So? Right? And this, I think, goes back, and I mentioned this in one of the earlier videos, this idea that we equate the human body, the naked human body, with sex instead of recognizing that it's anatomy. And so adolescents who are going through puberty, who are going through the cognitive changes, who are going through the social transitions, who are trying to figure out who they are and where they belong in this world, also then, if they're transgender or if they're homosexual or bisexual, have to deal with that too. Can't we take that off their plate? Right? Okay, another soapbox moment. I'm going to try to step off now. Okay, gender role socialization during adolescence. What we end up seeing is this gender intensification hypothesis, which is pressure to conform to gender role behavior intensifies in adolescence. So we'll allow little girls to be tomboys up to a point, right? We'll let little boys play house up to a point. But in adolescence, an adolescent male who wants to do the cleaning and the cooking and the laundry, what's wrong with him? An adolescent girl who would rather race cars and wrestle, what's wrong with her, right? This really intensifies, and of course is then going to factor into our identity, what we do as a person of our gender, how we identify in that way. And then for masculinity and femininity, of course, some people are more masculine, some people are more feminine of both genders. So you have some women who are quite masculine, you have some men who are quite feminine, and those traits tend to be stable over time. Okay, we're going to shift over to autonomy. So the second chapter is autonomy, and I'm going to try to go a little bit faster. I don't think there's any soapbox moments coming up in this one, because I do realize this video is going to run a little bit longer. But hey, the last one, work, leisure, and media, ran shorter. So it all evens out in the wash. So when we're talking about autonomy, we're really talking about actually 3 types of autonomy that we're going to develop: emotional, behavioral, and cognitive. Emotional autonomy is the establishment of a more adult-like and less childish close relationship with family and peers. Behavioral autonomy is the capacity to make independent decisions and follow through with them. And then cognitive autonomy is establishment of individual set of beliefs, opinions, and values. So each of these things is going to happen over the course of adolescence. And they don't happen, it's not like, okay, I've achieved emotional autonomy, let me move on to cognitive autonomy. Like so many other things, they're all kind of happening at the same time, and we don't necessarily establish all of them at the same time either, though. They're all in the works. So when we're talking about emotional autonomy, what we're really talking about are these 2 concepts of detachment or individuation. Detachment is when we really sever our emotional attachment to our parents or authority figures. So it's that no, you don't get to tell me what to do, how to be anymore. I'm my own person. And then individuation is the sense of being an autonomous, independent person. And what's kind of different about detachment and individuation, with individuation, we understand that we're our own independent, autonomous person, But we can also still have attachments to our parents. We could still value our parents' input. We could still go to them for information. We don't feel this like, I must separate from you, which is what we see with detachment. In terms of behavioral autonomy, we see changes in our decision-making ability, and certainly our ability to think in different ways and consider possibilities and consequences changes how we make decisions, right? So when we're children, we really make decisions based on, am I going to get in trouble or not? As adolescents, we start to realize, like, okay, that's one factor to consider. But another factor might be, how does this line up with how I see myself as a person? Another factor might be like, well, this is the positive things that can happen, but the consequences, I don't know if they're worth it to get that. Like, what's the trade-off, right? We're able to really think about that a little bit more and make decisions in a different way. And then, of course, there are changes in susceptibility to influence, and this is where we talk a little bit about peer pressure. Peer pressure is, of course, an issue in adolescence. You know, everybody's doing it, why don't you do it? And peer pressure actually does sometimes lead adolescents to do things they wouldn't normally do. But what it could also do is lead someone to do something that they were gonna do, they're just gonna do it a little bit sooner, right? They're gonna do it a little bit earlier because of the peer pressure or under different circumstances. We often think about peer pressure in a very negative way, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes our peers influence us to do positive things. And I find that when we talk about adolescents and their behavior, we tend to focus so much more on the negative and not the positive. And when we talk a little bit about cognitive autonomy and moral reasoning, we'll talk a little bit about more of the pro-social behavior. But I think it's important to remember that peers can pressure us in both ways. They can pressure us to try things and do things that are negative, but peers can also encourage us to volunteer or to go rake leaves for seniors or to do other helpful things. So we do want to keep that in mind as well. And then finally, the development of cognitive autonomy, and this is where we're really focusing on that moral development. Certainly, pro-social behavior is behavior that helps that helps other people. So it's not just about helping ourselves, it's helping others. And Lawrence Kohlberg, of course, talked about the stages of moral reasoning. The 3 stages: pre-conventional, which is childhood, where the focus is on the outcome to the person. Conventional, which is late childhood, early adolescence, is where we focus on how the individual will be judged by others. We think about what social conventions are, what the rules are. And then post-conventional, which Kohlberg said was in fact relatively rare, and many adults do not reach this. And this is what's known as principled moral reasoning. And so what I'm going to do is give you this example. So this example is in your text. It's on page 261, and it's probably the most well-known dilemma used by researchers who study moral reasoning. Okay? And so it involves a man who had to choose between stealing a drug to save his wife or letting his wife remain mortally ill. And so this is on page 261 of your text. And here it is. In Europe, a woman was near death from a very bad disease, a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which was half of what it would cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should the husband have done that? Was it right or wrong? And of course, there's a lot of debate that could happen there, right? And so that's one of the ways that we see where people are at in their thinking of, was it right or wrong? Are they thinking about, well, Heinz saved his wife's life, or Heinz committed a robbery and he's going to go to jail. Okay, well, we're sort of on pre-conventional there. Conventional, we start thinking about, well, you know, there are rules, there are laws, you're not supposed to break in, but he also tried, like he tried to pay the guy, he tried to work out a payment plan, but the druggist was being unreasonable, and this was the only way of saving his wife, so like, it's still not good, but like, maybe it's okay-ish, right? And then post-conventional, we go even more into the morals of the druggist, the morals of Heinz, what the likelihood of his wife actually dying versus actually being saved are, and we think about it in much different ways. In post-conventional, we tend to think that rules are relative. We have a moral duty to do certain things, and we think in more abstract principles. Moral reasoning and moral behavior. So, as you might think, as we develop our moral reasoning, as we start thinking more in the conventional and heading towards post-conventional, that's going to change our behavior. And we're going to sort of go into that bigger picture, you know, how does this help someone on the individual level versus what does it mean for society? It's kind of like the death penalty. The death penalty is used for two reasons. One is punishment and one is deterrence. Thing is, though, the fact that the death penalty is on the books, at least in the US, doesn't seem to deter people from committing the type of crimes that could land them the death penalty. So it's not working from a deterrence level, which means that really it's punishment. But isn't our criminal justice system based on rehabilitating people, right? We do want them to serve some time and have some time away from society where they can't cause any harm, but isn't the point to rehabilitate them, to help them not do the same things again? So how does putting someone to death do that? So from a moral reasoning standpoint, the death penalty, I think, is right up here at pre-conventional. I don't think it's okay. That's my own personal feeling. But again, you're welcome to have a different opinion. That's totally fine. But I think we start to see, as we start to reason differently, we think about behavior and other people's behavior differently as well. And then finally, so thinking about pro-social reasoning, pro-social behavior, and volunteerism. This is focusing on the good things that teens do. So as I was mentioning earlier, we tend to focus on the negative. We should maybe be thinking a little more about the positive as well. Certainly a lot of high schools and universities encourage volunteering, community service learning, internship things. So there's lots of different ways to have a positive impact and to engage in some pro-social behavior, so behavior that, again, helps other people. And then we've already talked about this a little bit. We talked about it with cognitive development, both political thinking during adolescence and religious beliefs during adolescence. And again, it's those cognitive changes that allow us to think in different ways. I also totally realized that at the beginning of this slide, I should have told you that quiz question 9, the answer is D. So the answer for the quiz for quiz question 9 is D. And then finally, your movie for discussion. The movie that you're going to be watching this week is called Blinded by the Light. Please watch it prior to completing the quiz for the chapter and prior to class. The movie is about 2 hours long. There's the link for Criterion On Demand. If the link doesn't work, go to the MRU Library website, search for Blinded by the Light. It's available and streaming on the Criterion On Demand service. You will need to be logged in with your MRU credentials. Some things to consider for your reflection. How might Javid and his father's relationship been different if they had both been born in the UK? How did discovering Bruce Springsteen's music change Javid's identity, if at all? And Javid's father wanted him to study economics while Javid wanted to pursue poetry and writing. How do perceived gender role behaviors play into the conflict between the two?